Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 62 of Masechta Pesachim, Daf Samach Beis. Now, yesterday I noticed on YouTube, I got a comment from one of the Chevre. He requested that I should put, he wants to see a Stratocaster in the background of the video. So Lemaisa, I put a Stratocaster there in. That's a Fender Stratocaster from, I used to play it in high school, back when I used to fiddle with the guitar. Let's go weiter. So, today's daf, we sort of wrap up our discussion from, well, I wouldn't say wrap up, but sort of conclude what we started yesterday in terms of machlokas between Rabbi and Rav Chizda regarding doing Zrikas Hadam for an oral, for somebody who does not have a bris milah. And then we get into a question that raises a distinction, who really tries to define the Tumah comparison from yesterday, right? We compared at one point the inability of uncircumcised people to bring a Korban Pesach. We compared that to the inability of Tameh people. So we're going to discuss what kind of Tumah are we talking about. And then we get into the very interesting sugya of shechting a non-Korban Pesach with the intention of a Korban Pesach, but it's not an Erev Pesach. Alright, what do you want me to tell you? That's what we're going to talk about. And at the end we get to this actually interesting Gemara about the Sefer Yuchsin, which is kind of interesting. Okay, let's go weiter. So, we are going to start on Daf Samach Aleph Mud Beis, about 5-6 lines from the bottom. Maskif lo Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asked a question. So yesterday we were assuming that when the pasuk says V'chol Arol, right? What does it say? V'chol Arol lo yochal bo. Anybody who doesn't have a bris milah is unable to partake, to eat the Korban Pesach. So we assumed yesterday that V'chol Arol means if you have an entire group of Arelim, so then they would be unable to eat the Korban Pesach, and if you shecht the Korban Pesach with them in mind, it's going to be a problem. But if you have a group that has some Arelim in the group, but it's not entirely Arelim, so then they would be able to eat the Korban Pesach. The Arelim wouldn't be able to eat the Korban Pesach, but the Shechita of the Korban Pesach wouldn't be possible. Now, therefore, because we already know that from B'chol Arol lo yochal bo, so what do we learn out from Zos? What does it say? Zos. What does the pasuk say? Zos chukas Pesach. Pesach. Ugh, it's too small for me. Is my eyesight getting worse as I get older, or is it just really freaking small? I think it might just be really freaking small. But I think it's Zos chukas Pesach. So what do we learn out from Zos? What's it excluding? So it's excluding Zrika. Rabbah went more lenient to say that by Zrika, even if you did the Zrika Sadam for an entire, right, meaning if you shechted it for people with a bris milah, but then you did the Zrika Sadam with the intention of people without a bris milah, so then that would be acceptable. Whereas Rav Chizda takes it to the other extreme, which is that even if part of the group was uncircumcised, when it comes to the Zrika, it would be a problem. So now, Rav Ashi takes a different approach, which is that from V'chol Arol doesn't teach that the entire group would have to be uncircumcised, but if part of the group was uncircumcised, then it would be acceptable. Rather, Maskif lo Rav Ashi said, he asks, Mimaydai V'chol Arol kula mashma. Why are we so convinced that when the pasuk says V'chol Arol lo yochal bo, that it means that don't shech the Korban Pesach for a group that consists entirely of Arelim, but if only part of the group was Arelim, you would be, right, the Korban Pesach wouldn't be possible. Maybe, what I'll say is that when it says V'chol Arol yochal bo, it means any amount of Arelus, right? Meaning, even if part of the group was Arelim, the Shechita would be possible. And therefore, because of Rachmana Zos, and that is why the pasuk then had to say Zos, the Adi Ika Kula Orla Lo Pasla. That no, in order for the Korban Pesach to be possible, it would have to have been shechted for in a group that consisted entirely of arelim, but if only some of them were arelim, it would be acceptable. And so therefore we see, right, and therefore vizos lo shna b'shchita below shna b'zrika. Therefore zos is coming to teach us that it's not enough if only part of the group is arelim. You need a zos, an entire entity, the entire group to be uncircumcised, and then the Korban Pesach that you shechted would be possible, as well as by zrika. If you did the zrika for an entire group of arelim, it would be possible as well. So Ella Amar Rashi, well then what's the machlokas between Rav Chizda and Rabbah? Rav Chizda v'Rabbah b'haikra kamiflige, they're arguing about the following pasuk: v'nirtzlo l'chaper olav v'lo al chavero. That the pasuk says at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, v'nirtzlo l'chaper olav, that's talking about the zrika sadam, and it says l'chaper olav, to atone for him, olav v'lo al chavero, on him and not for his friend. Meaning that when you do the zrika sadam, it has to be for the person who it's intended for. Okay, so if Ruvain is bringing a korban, so the zrika sadam, the throwing of the blood on the mizbeach, needs to be with the intention of Ruvain, not for Shimon. If you do it for Shimon, it's a problem. Okay, how does that tie into our circumcised, uncircumcised friends? So it ties in the following way. So let's say you have a fellow, and he shechs the korban pesach, and when he does the zrika sadam, he does the zrika sadam for a group of arelim, right? So So let's say you have a group, and the group is partially circumcised, partially uncircumcised, meaning some of them are Okay. Anyways, some of them have a bris milah, some of them do not. So now you do the now you shech the korban pesach with in mind the circumcised chaver, and then you do the zrika sadam, and you have in mind the uncircumcised chaver. So everyone agrees that is going to be a problem, because as Rav Ashi just said, that zos means if you have an entire group of arelim, whether it's the shchita, whether it's the zrika, it's going to be a problem. So therefore, you did the shchita with the circumcised chevra in mind, and then you did the zrika sadam with the uncircumcised chevra in mind. So because it was a group, the zrika sadam was for a group entirely of uncircumcised chevra, so therefore it will not work. Everyone agrees. However, that is also assuming that the entire group was shaykh to that korban pesach, right? Because we've been talking about that you need a group specifically designated for a korban pesach, right? A korban pesach has to be eaten in a predetermined group, pre-organized group. So, therefore, that is what we're talking about. Now, however, what if you did the following? You shechted the korban pesach, okay, but then when you did the zrika sadam, you had in mind arelim, uncircumcised chevra, who were not part of the group associated with this korban pesach. Therefore, you're basically doing the zrika sadam for somebody else. It's already similar now to a case of v'nir tzlo l'chaper olav, right? That the zrika sadam has to be for the person who the korban is for, and therefore in this case, the korban pesach is for the group that's associated with this particular animal. And here you did the zrika sadam for a different group. And it so happens to be that this different group that you are doing the zrika sadam in mind for is entirely uncircumcised. So now in this case, what should be our attitude toward it? Do we say, well, it's a situation of you did zrika sadam for people who are not associated with this korban, and should be a problem. But maybe we could say, well, but since arelim are people who are not shaykh to korban pesach, maybe it's not a problem, right? Because in order for it to be a problem, it has to be somebody at least who has some kind of connection to korban pesach. Over here, these are people who aren't even able to bring korban pesach b'chlal. So maybe this concept of v'nir tzlo l'chaper olav, it says, right? What does it say? It says Like it has to be chavero, right? Dafka has to be somebody who's able to, right? Exactly. Chavero the pasum mishum shinoi bailim dumya didei ba'inon, right? It has to be somebody similar to him, and here these people are not similar, so therefore maybe it shouldn't be shaykh. So that is the machlokas between Rabba and Rav Chizda right now. Okay, let's see. Let's go weiter. So Rabba savar chavero dumya didei. So Rabba says, look, when we're saying it's a problem if you do zrikas hadam for Shimon, meaning if Reuven brings the korban and you do zrikas hadam with Shimon in mind, well, that's a problem because Reuven and Shimon are kilu equally able to bring that korban. However, Mahu de bar kapara, af chavera de bar kapara, right? Meaning, so by Reuven and Shimon, both Reuven and Shimon are people who are, have some kind of ability to bring that korban. Lafuke hay arel de la bar kaparu, to the exclusion of this arel, or this group of arelim, who are unable to bring the korban pesach bichlal. So therefore, it would not be an issue if you have them in mind when you do zrikas hadam, because it's like having people in mind who are completely unaffiliated with this korban whatsoever, so it wouldn't actually be a problem. Rav Chizda says, Hai Arul Nami, that no, if you have in mind this group of uncircumcised chevra, it's also going to be a problem. Why? I thought they're not allowed to bring the korban pesach. Kevin de bar chiyuvahu bar kaparahu ho'il de bay masakin nafshe. So, well, they're not completely unassociated with the korban pesach, because why can't they eat the korban pesach? Because they don't have a bris milah. Well, that's remediable. Get a bris milah, and now you can, once you get a bris milah, then you'll be shaykh to the korban pesach. So therefore, Rav Chizda wants to say that since theoretically, if they get a bris milah, there's nothing wrong with them inherently. So therefore, it would be a problem if you have them in mind when you do the zrikas hadam. Okie dokie. Well, that's machlokas between Rabba and Rav Chizda. Fine. Very good. So now, what's interesting about that is that here we have Rav Chizda who's saying ho'il, right? He's saying that, well, since this fellow can get a bris milah and then he'll be shaykh to the korban pesach, so therefore it's going to be a problem if you have him or a group of hymns in mind when you do the zrikas hadam. Now, obviously, you're all very perturbed because we had a machlokas recently between the same Rabba and Rav Chizda regarding ho'il, and Rabba was the one who was saying ho'il, and Rav Chizda was saying that we don't say ho'il. So the Gemara is about to ask that. Umi isle Rav Chizda ho'il? Does Rav Chizda really hold of ho'il? V'itmar. But we learned on Daf Mem Vav Mud Beis. Wow, these pages fly by. When you learn one page every day, before you know it, you're already 2.5 weeks past that. Oh my goodness gracious. Or am I just doing math wrong? No, I don't think I am. What's 62 minus 46? What, nobody knows? 16, right? So that's like over 2 weeks, I think. 14 divided by 2. So it's 2 with a remainder of 2, right? Let's go weiter. Modulo. I didn't know what modulo was until I got into computer programming. You guys know what modulo is? Let's go weiter. So mi isle Rav Chizda ho'il? Does Rav Chizda really hold of ho'il? But we learned 2 weeks and 2 days ago. Ha'ofem Yom Tov l'chol. So somebody who on Yom Tov he bakes on Yom Tov afternoon, and clearly what he's baking is not for Yom Tov. He already ate his Yom Tov Sudas. So what he's baking is for the weekday that follows Yom Tov. So Rav Chizda Amar Loke, Rabba Amar Eno Loke. Rav Chizda says we whip him. Rabba says we don't whip him. Rabba Amar Eno Loke. Rabba says we don't whip him. Aminan ho'il. V'imikali le orchim chazile hashanami chazile v'lo laki. So Rabba says we're not going to whip him because since theoretically if guests came over, then they would be able to eat this bread that then he would serve this whatever he's baking, and it would end up being for Yom Tov. So therefore, even now when there are no guests, but nonetheless, since theoretically guests can come, so we could argue that we can consider what he's baking to be for Yom Tov, and we're not going to whip him. Rav Chizda Amar Loke. Rav Chizda says that we whip him. Lo amrinon ho'il, because we don't say hoil. We don't say, well, maybe since people can come, then we're not going to whip him. But no, we're not going to say that. So we see that Rabbah is the one who says hoil. Rav Chisda doesn't say hoil, and yet over here we seem to be saying the opposite. Rav Chisda is the one who's saying hoil, since he can get a bris milah, and then he'll be shaykh to the Korban Pesach. So it's going to be a problem if you have him in mind when you do the Zrikas Hadam. Rabbah doesn't say hoil. So B'Shlama D'Rabbah lo kasha. So I understand why Rabbah is not going to be an issue, because because there's a difference over here. Over here, it's not just like, okay, fine, so I'll get a bris milah. Like, things need to happen in order for him to get a bris milah. Like, it's missing an activity, an action. Namely, a bris milah needs to happen. However, when it came to the baking on Yom Tif, there's nothing for him to do anymore. He already baked the thing. Now, if friends show up, that would be great. But he doesn't need to do anything. And therefore, Rabbah is willing to say, oh, well, since it's not like he has to do anything, there's no activity that he needs to do separating him from where he is right now and the situation that will occur, if the friends come on their own. Whereas, so that's why he's willing to say hoil on Yom Tiv. But by bris milah, he's not willing to say hoil, since it's not so simple to just say, well, since if he just gets a bris milah, well, he has to first get a bris milah. El Rav Chisda kasha. But what about Rav Chisda? How come he's willing to say hoil in this situation by a fellow who needs a bris milah by Pesach, and yet on Yom Tif, when there's no activities lacking, he's unwilling to say hoil? So the Gemara answers, Amre kileis le Rav Chisda hoil lekula lechumra islay. So when is Rav Chisda willing to say hoil? When it's lechumra, when it's more stringent. When is he not willing to say hoil? When it's more lenient. So meaning, when it came to Yom Tif, and we're saying, if we say hoil, if we say, well, since his friends could show up and he'll be able to eat the bread, well, by saying hoil, we're going to spare him the whip. We don't want to spare him the whip. So therefore we don't say hoil. We don't want to be lenient. Whereas, when it comes to Korban Pesach, if we say hoil, and we say, well, since if he gets a bris milah, he'll be shaykh to the Korban Pesach, and because we're going to say hoil, that means that doing Zrikas Hadam with him in mind is going to be possible, well, we're going to say hoil in order to be more stringent. Okay, very, very good. Alright, let's go weiter. Okay, so this is an interesting, it's an interesting question. It's going to be a shtickle arichos, and then we're really going to get to the question in probably about 20 lines from now. But it's just, it's not such a big deal. It's just nice, good, geschmacke Gemara. So you guys ready? Let's go weiter. Amarle, Marzutra Breid to Rav Mari le Ravina. So Marzutra Breid to Rav Mari said to Ravina, okay, Katani, Hoil ve'orla poselas ve'tuma poselas. No, we had said this yesterday. We were trying to figure out if you have a group that consists partially of a chever with a bris milah and partially of chever without a bris milah. We were trying to figure out if you shech the Korban Pesach with them in mind, with this group in mind, would it work or not? So we were trying to figure it out, and we said, well, we can compare it to Tumah, right? Because after all, people who are Tameh are unable to bring the Korban Pesach. So why don't we compare the group of Arelim to the group of Tameh people, and say that just like the group of Tameh people, if part of them are Tameh, part of them are Tahor, it would be acceptable. So let's say the same thing by Arelim. If part of the group is Arelim and part of the group is not Arelim, is Mulim, they have a bris milah, so then let's say that would be acceptable as well. So now, Katani ho'ov orla poselas v'tuma poselas. So we had said yesterday that, well, since orla is poselas, since if somebody doesn't have bris milah, you can't bring the Korban Pesach and you can't shech the Korban Pesach for him. And the same thing applies to somebody who's tameh. Matuma lo asaba miktsas tuma kechol tuma. Well, just like when it comes to tuma, if part of the group is tameh and part of the group is tar, we don't treat it as though the entire group is tameh. Af orla lo asa miktsas orla kechol orla. So also, when it comes to Orla, people who don't have a bris milah, so we don't treat a combination group as if the entire group was Arelim. That was our suggestion yesterday. So now, Haituma Echidami. So this Tuma, what kind of Tuma are we talking about? When we say that, well, since when it comes to Tuma, if part of the group is Tameh, so then it works, so then it would be kosher, so, and we don't treat it as if the whole group was Tameh, so let's say the same thing by Arelim. So Ilemu B'tumas Gavre, if we're talking about, kind of like I was just saying, people, that, I don't know, you have 10 people in the group, 5 of them are Tameh, 5 of them are Tahor, Umaylo Asaba Miktsas Tuma Kechol Tuma. What does it mean that we don't treat partial Tuma like complete Tuma? The Ika Arba Vachmisha Gavre Tmein, that if you have 4 or 5 Chevre who are Tameh, V'Arba Vachmisha Gavre Tahorin, and then you have another 4 or 5 Chevre in that group who are Tahor, Lo Pasilu Tmein the Tahorin. And we're saying that the fact that 4 or 5 of them, I assume at the point of 4 or 5 is meaning you have a group that has some members that are Tameh and some members that are Tahor. And we're saying that the members that are Tameh will not mess things up for the members who are Tahor. But if that's the case, Gabi Orla Nami, Halo Pasle. But we already know that when it comes to Arelim. Titnan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Lemulin V'la Arelim, kosher. That our Mishnah had said that if you shech the korban Pesach and you have in mind both mulim and arelim, both people with a bris milah and people without a bris milah, it's kosher. So ma'ishna tuma de pshitale, u'ma'ishna orla de mesapkale. Well then, how come by tuma it's obvious to us and by orla it's not, right? Meaning, in our Mishnah it says that if you shech the korban Pesach with tuma and tahara in mind, right, a group comprised of both Tameh people and Tahor people, so we say it's kosher. And it also says lemulim v'la'arein, if you shech the korban Pesach for a group that has members who are circumcised and members who are not circumcised, so that would be kosher as well. Well then, how come in our Gemara we're assuming it's obvious to us that the Tameh people are kosher, but when you have the group of arelim and mulim, maybe it's a problem? Why should we, assume one is more kosher than the other? No. So the point is that the tuma that we're talking about, that it's obvious to us that by tuma it works, but we're not sure about arelim, is that when the meat itself becomes tameh. What does it mean that by tuma we don't treat partial tuma like complete tuma? That if one of the limbs becomes tameh, so then the limb that becomes tameh will have to burn. And the rest of it we will eat. So therefore, when we were trying to figure out, for whatever reason, if you have a group that's comprised partially of circumcised chevre and partially of non-circumcised chevre, and we said, well, maybe we can compare it to tuma, that partial tuma is acceptable. We don't treat it as though it was complete tuma. So that's talking about meat, right? Tameh meat. That if you have tameh meat, that part of it is tameh, so then it's okay. It's not going to disqualify the whole thing, and therefore we want to bring a precedent from there to say that also by arelim and mulim, the combination will not be problematic. So b'mayu kimta b'tumas baser. Okay, fine. So we want to say then that the tuma that we're talking about and that we're comparing to arelim is the tuma of the meat, not the tuma of the people. Okay, but ema seifa. But then if we continue in the Mishnah, in the Gemara that we did yesterday, we suggested dan davar she'enu noig b'chol azvachim midavar she'enu noig b'chol azvachim. Well, let's compare arelus, which is something that doesn't apply to all korbanos, to tuma, which doesn't apply to all korbanos, right? Because in general, if you are uncircumcised or if you are impure, so you're still able to bring a korban. You can't bring it yourself, but you could send somebody else to do it for you. So therefore we suggested that we should learn arelus out from tuma, since those are both things that aren't shaykh to most korbanos. They're unique to korban pesach. And don't learn out arelim from pigul, because pigul is a halacha that applies to all korbanos. So umay tuma. So what's the tuma that we're talking about when it comes to the tuma that is unique to korban pesach? Inema tumas baser, amay noig b'chol azvachim. Amay eino noig b'chol azvachim. If we're saying that it's talking about the tumas baser that we wanted to say a minute ago, that the tuma that's unique to korban pesach is that if part of the animal becomes tameh, so then it would be acceptable, but that's really shaykh to all korbanos. Elapshita b'tumas gavre. So rather, it must be talking about the fact that people who are tameh are unable to bring the korban pesach, but that's unique to korban pesach. What does it mean that it's not a halacha by all other korbanos? Because when it comes to other korbanos, people are uncircumcised and people are impure are able to send their korban with somebody else. But when it comes to korban pesach, an uncircumcised fellow or an impure fellow, both of them are unable to send their korban pesach. So it must be that for this part, the part that we're saying that arelim and tmeim are unique in that they apply only to korban pesach, that must be talking about the people themselves. That it's unique that by korban pesach, arelim and tmeim people are unable to have any part in the korban pesach, whereas by other korbanos they could send it with other people. So reisha b'tumas baso v'seva b'tumas gabri, and that is Mar Zutra Breder Rav Mari's question that I don't understand, because at the beginning of the comparison, when we were comparing arelim to tmeim, we were saying that that's talking about tumas basar, because if it's talking about tumas gavre, we already know tumas gavre from our Mishnah, so it must be talking about tumas basar. Yet in the Seifa, when it's talking about arelim and tmeim being unique to korban pesach, it's talking about tumas gavre. So reisha b'tumas basar v'seva b'tumas gavre. Are we saying that the first part is talking about meat that is tameh, and the second part of the brayso is talking about people that are tameh? So amrle in shem tuma kaparich. So first Ravina says yes, that's true, and it's not a big deal that the reisha is talking about tumas basar and the Sefer is talking about tumas gavre, because we're talking about tuma in general. Right, we weren't too fussed about what the particulars of the tuma. We were talking about learning it out from tuma in general, and shem tuma kaparich. It was asking about tuma in general, but not digging into the details of if it was tumas basar or tumas gavre. V'bais or if you want, I will say sefer nami b'tumas basar. That even the second part, the part that is unique to korban pesach, is also talking about tumas basar. Well, what's unique about tumas basar by korban pesach? What is something that's unique to korban pesach by tumas basar that isn't shaykh to other korbanis? Because when it comes to other korbanis, because when it comes to other korbanis, right? So there's like different parts of the korbanos. There are parts of it that go on the mizbeach, right? And that's the chelev, right? The fats go on the mizbeach. But then there's also the meat, and depending on the type of korban it is, maybe the meat can be eaten by kohanim. So by other zvachim, by other korbanis, ben shnit mechelev, whether it's the fats that go on the mizbeach that got tameh, uvasar kaim, but the meat is still intact, ben shnit mabasar v'chelev kaim, or whether the meat got tameh, but the chelev that goes on the mizbeach is still intact. Either way, zorik esadam, you could do zrika sadam. You could throw the blood on the mizbeach. V'ilu b'pesach, But what's unique about Pesach in this respect is that nitmacheh levavasar kaim zorik es adam, that if the chelev became tameh, but the meat is still around, so then you could do zrikas adam. However, nitma basar v'chelev kaim ein zorik es adam. If it's the meat that became tameh, even though the fats that go on the mizbeach are still pure, ein zorik es adam, you're not going to be allowed to do zrikas hadam. So we see that, and that's because, inherent in the Korban Pesach is the ability to be able to eat the Korban Pesach. And therefore, if the meat, which is what you're going to eat, becomes tameh, so then you're going to be, and it's inedible, so then you're not going to do zrikas hadam. So what's unique about even tumas basar when it comes to Korban Pesach is that if the meat becomes tameh, even though the fats are still intact, you'd be unable to do zrikas hadam. So mayukimta b'tumas basar. Okay, fine. So great. So therefore, we could say that the Reisha and the Seifa are both talking about tumas basar. Okay. Ema Seifa. But if we continue going weiter in the Brisa, it says dan in davar shlohutu michlalo midavar shlohutu michlalo vatochiach tuma shariutu michlala. The Brisa had suggested, well, maybe Taka, we should learn out Orla from Pigel. Because after all, Orla, right, in Arel, somebody who's uncircumcised will never be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Ever. There's no exceptions. Also Pigel. There's no exceptions. There's no Korban where you're allowed to think to eat it, have intention to eat it outside of its proper time. That's just never going to happen. Therefore, we could say that Orla and Pigel are comparable, but don't compare Orla to Tuma. Why? Sharihutu michlala. Because there are cases where Tuma is actually acceptable. What does that mean? But what are we talking about? In what case is Tuma acceptable? Ilema b'tumas basar eicha utra. If we're talking about Tameh meat, where is Tameh meat ever going to be acceptable? Halabshita b'tumas gavre. Rather, must be talking about Tameh people. Eicha utra michlala b'tzibur. Where is it permitted? B'tzibur, in the congregation. Meaning, if the majority of the Yidden are Tameh, so then you'd be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Even though the people are Tameh, you'd be able to bring the Korban Pesach. So we see that. So when we're saying that Tuma is sometimes permissible, it's talking about Tumas Gavre, people. That if you have a majority of the people of Israel are Tameh, you can nonetheless bring the Korban Pesach. So what do we see? So we see that the Tumah is talking about Tumas Gavre. So we've just said how both we could say that the Reisha and the Sefer are talking about Tumas Basar, but what about then when we talk about Tumah Hutra Michlala? That's talking about people. So Reisha b'Tumas Basar, Sefer b'Tumas Gavre. So are we going to say that the first part is talking about Tumas Basar and the end we're talking about Tumah of people? Yes, Shem Tumah Kaparach, because we're really just concerned about Tumah. We're not concerned about the specifics of if it is people or meat. Vibai Sema, if you want, I will say. Kula b'Tumas Basar, no, it's actually entirely talking about the Tumah of the meat. Behecha Hutra, and where do we permit meat that is tameh? Betumas Pesach, when the Korban Pesach is tameh, Detnan Pesach haba betuma, nechal betuma, shelo ba mitchilaso ela la'achila, that if you have a Korban Pesach, if the majority of the Yidden are tameh, and because they're tameh, they bring the Korban Pesach, so then in that case, even if the Korban Pesach is tameh, you're going to be allowed to eat the meat, right? Shelo ba mitchilaso ela la'achila, because eating the Korban Pesach is an integral part of the Korban Pesach experience, and therefore, if you have a situation where the majority of the Yidden are tameh, and therefore they're bringing the Korban Pesach, you'd be able to eat it even betuma, I guess even if the meat is tameh, and therefore, So therefore we could see that even if the meat is tameh, it is acceptable. Okay, so we could say that the entire brisa is talking about tumas basar. Alright, exciting stuff. Let's go weiter. Masiv Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua. Oh, so Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua asks a kasha. So Chevra, whenever you see Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua, who of course immediately do you think of? Rav Papa. Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua and Rav Papa, they go together like, what do they go together like? I don't know. Tell us in the comments. Alright, so Masiv Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua. So Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua asks the kasha. HaPesach Shava Shnaso. Okay, if you have a Korban Pesach that's more than a year old, right? Let's say right after Pesach, you set aside an animal and you say, this is going to be my Korban Pesach next year. The problem is, by the time next year comes around, it's already more than a year old. And a Keves Ben Shnaso, you need a sheep that's within its first year. So it's going to be a problem. So what happens? So that animal that you set aside to be your Korban Pesach, Lemaise, becomes a Shlamim. At that minute, you can't bring it as a Korban Pesach. So at that point, it just Memele becomes a Korban Shlamim, and you could bring it as a Korban Shlamim. Okay. So Rav Huna Breder of Yoshua asks a kasha. Pesach Shava Shnoso. So if you have a Pesach that, over the year it got older, and now it's more than a year old. V'shachto bizmano lishmo. And now you shecht it on the 14th day of Nisan of the next year, and you shecht it as a Korban Pesach. Now it's too old, it can't be a Korban Pesach, it needs to be shechted as a Shlamim at this point. But you shechted it nonetheless on the 14th of Nisan as a Korban Pesach. V'chein, and similarly, hashochet acherim l'shem Pesach bizmano. Or if you take some other Korban that's not supposed to be a Korban Pesach, and you shecht it as a Korban Pesach on the 14th day of Nisan. So Rabbi Eliezer posel Rabbi Yeshua machshir. Rabbi Eliezer says it's a problem. Rabbi Yeshua says it's okay. Okay, fine. Time of Bismano. Now the reason why, so this is Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua's kasha, that he wants to say that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says that shechting this korban is a problem is because it was the 14th day of Nisan. Hashelo Bismano, but if you shechted this korban at some other time, kosher, it would be acceptable. So even Rabbi Eliezer would say that, if you shechted this korban, which is now supposed to be a shlamim, lishmo, as a korban Pesach, but it wasn't the 14th day of Nisan, so then it would be kosher. Okay. But ve'amai. Now this is going to be a kasha on Rav Chizda, because we had said, or at least our understanding of Rav Chizda, because we had said that according to Rav Chizda, he would say ho'il if it's the case of being lechumra, right? So we'll say ho'il when it comes to the korban Pesach that you shechted with arelim in mind from a different group, since theoretically they can get a bris milah and be shaykh to korban Pesach. So therefore we'll say ho'il lechumra. But over here, ve'amai, Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua asks, why if you shecht this Korban Pesach that is more than a year old, not on the 14th day of Nisan, but you shecht it with the intention of a Korban Pesach, why would that be acceptable? Nemahol v'zmano pasol, shlo v'zmano nami pasol. Why don't we say ho'il? Why don't we say, well, since if you would shecht this Korban on the 14th day of Nisan, it would be a problem. So then also when you shecht it on some other day, it's also going to be a problem. That is the Gemara's kasha. Why do we say that on some other day it would be okay? What happened to ho'il? So Rav Papa shani osam damar krov amatim zevach pesachu. So Rav Papa says that no, it's different when in the case in that brisa that it says v'amartim zevach pesachu, that you will say that it is a that it is a Pesach offering. Who ba'avayoso, that it has to be it and like it itself, right? Meaning on the 14th day of Nisan, you have to slaughter a korban Pesach that is, only a korban Pesach. Lo hu lishum acherim v'lo acherim lishmo, not a korban Pesach shechted as some other animal, and not some other animal shechted as a korban Pesach. Bizmano shehu pasul l'shum acherim. So on the 14th day of Pesach, when you'd be unable to shecht a korban Pesach as some other offering, acherim psulim lishmo, so then you're also unable to shecht some other offering for it. Shelo bizmano, but if it's not erev Pesach, well then shehu kosher l'shum acherim, Acherim ksherim lishmo, that you would be able to shech the korban Pesach as some other animal, as some other korban, if it's not the 14th day of Pesach, of Nisan. Well then, acherim ksherim lishmo, if you would shech some other animal with the intention of a korban Pesach, when it's not the 14th day of Nisan, it would be acceptable. Alright, sounds good to me. Let's move on. Reb Simlai, also the Kamid Reb Yochanan. So this gets interesting, okay? Yeah, I know. This stuff has been super duper technical. I know. Also, last few days have been kind of technical, but I think, honestly, I don't know. How do you guys like this stuff? It's good, right? Of course it's good. But yeah, today's been a little technical. Let's go weiter. But this is interesting. Reb Simlai, also the Kamid Reb Yochanan. So Reb Simlai came to Reb Yochanan. Amarle, Nisni Limar Sefer Yuchsin. So Reb Simlai wanted Reb Yochanan to teach him the Sefer Yuchsin. The Sefer Yuchsin is the brises that we have on this Sfarim of Divrei Hayomim, the last books in the Tanakh, which discusses like inheritance, genealogy and stuff. So now apparently much of it was forgotten. So Reb Simlai wanted Reb Yochanan to teach it to him. Amle mehechanat. So Reb Yochanan, says, look, we don't just teach Sefer Yuchsin to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Where are you from, Mr. Rabbi Simlai? Amle milud. He said, I'm from Lud. Ve'echan mosvach. And where do you live? I don't know. What's the difference between where you're from and where do you live? I don't know. But he says Ben Arda. In Bavel. So, okay, he's from Lud, but he lives in Arda. But now he's with Rabbi Yochanan somewhere in Israel, I guess. Sounds good to me. Amle enidonin lo leludim v'lo lenardaim. V'choshkin Da'at milud umosvach ben Arda. And Rabbi Yochanan says, look man, you're out of luck. We don't teach Sefer Yuchsin to people from Lud, nor do we teach the Sefer Yuchsin to people from Narda. You're both from Lud and Narda. Get out of here. Kafya v'irtzi. But Reb Simlai was persistent, and he managed to convince Rabbi Yochanan to teach him the Sefer Yuchsin. Omelei nisnai begimel yarche. And he suggested to Rabbi Yochanan that they learn it over the course of 3 months. To which Rabbi Yochanan shakol kala pasak bey. To which Rabbi Yochanan for some reason threw some mud at Reb Simlai. I don't know why. Omar le. So Rabbi Yochanan said to Reb Simlai, Uma bruya devisu de Reb Meir. Bruya, the wife of Reb Meir. Barte de Reb Chananya ben Tradion. The daughter of Reb Chananya ben Tradion, one of the Asara Arugei Malchus. The Tanya Tzlas Mea Shmaitza Biyoma Migimul Mea Rabivasa. That Bruria learned 300 halachas every single day from 300 different rabbis. Fafilu achi lo yatzasai de chavasa betlas shnin. And even so, after 3 years of studying Sefer Yuchsin, she still did not complete it. And you really expect of Simlai to be able to learn Sefer Yuchsin in 3 months? And then when Reb Simlai was getting ready to leave at some point, he said to Reb Yochanan, Rebbe, ma ben lishmo v'shelo lishmo, la'ochlav v'shelo la'ochlav. And he says, hey Reb Yochanan, what's the difference between lishmo and shelo lishmo that we had said in our Mishnah the other day, that if you shech the korban Pesach with the intention of a korban Pesach, but also with the intention of a shlomim, it's a problem. Yet we said that if you shech the korban Pesach with the intention of a group, some of whom are able to eat the korban Pesach and some of whom are unable because they're old or sick, what's the difference, right? We said that that's kosher. So how come lishmo v'shelo lishmo is possible, whereas la'ochlav v'shelo la'ochlav is kosher? Amalei. So Yochanan responded, well, ho v'tzur me'abanan at tov ve'emalach. So Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Simlai, since you are a Talmud Chacham, come, I will explain it to you. Lishmo v'shelo lishmo psulo begufo. Okay, this is going to ring similar to like what we said, I think, was it yesterday? Or the day before? I think it may have been yesterday. I think. Who can remember? We move so fast. Yeah, I think it is. It was yesterday, I think. So when it comes to lishmo v'shelo lishmo, that if you shech the korban Pesach for, an intention of a shlomim or a Pesach, that has to do with the actual mahus of the animal. Right? Psula begufo. Right? It's an issue with the actual animal itself. It's a shlamim or it's a pesach. But in terms of who you're shechting the korban pesach for is more of a meta kind of thing. Right? It's not the animal itself, it's the people who are going to be, around the animal, eating the animal, partaking in the animal. Lishmo v'shelo lishmo. Additionally, when it comes to, for a pesach versus a shlamim, efshar levayer isuro. It's not very, you can't really tell like what your intention was, right? Meaning your intention was the shmo v'shelo l'shmo. How can you quantify that? Whereas the ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav efshar levayer isuro, you can kind of like figure out which parts, let's say, are relevant for like which people. If you have part of it the ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav, so you can kind of like say, okay, this part is the ochlav, this part is shelo l'ochlav. Okay. Lishma v'shelo lishmo. Also, additionally, when it comes to your intention, lishma v'shelo lishmo, yeshno b'dalet avodos. That applies to all four of the avodas, as we said the other day, right? That if you do any of the four avodas with the intention of a shlamim, it's going to be a problem. L'ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav einu bar ba'avodas. Whereas the ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav is specifically when it comes to shchita, right? If you shechted it for people who are able to eat it or not. And finally, lishmo v'shelo lishmo yeshno b'tzibur kibiyachid, whether you shech the korban lishma, or right as a pesach or a shlamim, or in some other context also for some other korban, right? The concept of lishmo v'shelo lishmo applies to private tzibors, right? Individual offerings or communal offerings. You have to have the proper intention. Whereas la'ochlav v'shelo la'ochlav eino b'tzibur kibiyachid. Whereas, for people who are able to eat it, is specifically for individual offerings, but not necessarily for communal offerings. Rav Ashi Omar Psulo Begufo V'Efshar Levayer Yisuro Chadamilsahi. Rav Ashi says, well, of these four things that these four distinctions that Rabbi Yochanan mentioned, the psula begufo, right? That we said that the shema v'shelo l'shmo actually has to do with the actual animal, and also the fact that efshar levayer isura, that you're unable to distinguish which parts of the animal you had kavana for. So chadamilsa, they're really the same thing. The matam omer psula begufo mishum the efshar levayer isura. How do we say that? Why do we say that the shema v'shelo l'shmo is a psul in the body of the korban? Because it's unable to distinguish between different parts of the animal. What you had, intentions of the shema versus shelo l'shmo. So therefore, the entire animal itself becomes tameh. Okay, fine. So that is why. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's answer for how come when you have lishma v'shelo lishma, it's a problem, whereas le'ochlav v'shelo le'ochlav is not a problem, because lishma v'shelo lishma, it applies to more cases. It's more of a significant issue. Okay, fine. Rami bar Rav Yehuda Omer Rav says, Rami bar Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav Miyom Shenigna Sefer Yuchsin. So from the day that Sefer Yuchsin got forgotten, Tashash Kochan Shel Chachamim, so the strength of the Chachamim became weak. V'cha me'or einayim, and the light of their eyes became weaker. Omer Marzucha said, Marzucha ben Eitzel le'Eitzel Ta'inu daled mea gamle didrasha, that between the words Eitzel and Eitzel in Divrei Hayamim, there's a parak that says Eitzel at the beginning and at the end, or at least a chunk of Divrei Hayamim. So on that chunk itself, they learned daled mea gamle didrasha, 400 laden camels worth of drushes, just from that chunk of Divrei Hayamim. Kal v'chomer, that they lost the entire Divrei Hayamim, they forgot it. So they forgot a lot of stuff. Wow, interesting. Well, that was Daf Samach Beis of Masechta Pesachim. Hope you enjoyed it. So let's do a shtickle review. So at the beginning we talked about Zrikas Adam for Arelim, right? If you do Zrikas Adam with the intention of Arelim who are not actually in the group associated with that particular Korban Pesach, Rabbah says that it's not going to be a problem, since these Arelim are unable to bring a Korban Pesach anyway, so they have nothing to do with a Korban Pesach in general, so therefore it's going to be, it's not going to mess things up. Whereas if Chizis says, well, if these Arelim get a bris milah, so then they can be connected to Korban Pesach, so therefore they will mess things up. He says ho'il. Okay, fine. We said, how come Rabbah was willing to say hoil when it comes to baking on Yom Tif, and Rav Chizda was not, yet over here Rabbah is not saying hoil and Rav Chizda is? We said, well, because Rabbah says hoil in the other case because there's no ma'aseh, there's no additional activity that needs to be done for us to say hoil, whereas over here to say hoil, he actually has to get a bris milah, which is like a lot of things that need to happen, and therefore we're not willing to simply just say hoil. Whereas with Chizda, his distinction was that we'll say hoil when it's the chumrah, such as here, to say that the Korban Pesach is going to be puzzle. But by Yom Tif, it would be lekula, would be lenient, because that would be, if we say hoil, then we won't give him lashes. Then we got into this long arichos by Mar Zutra, Breder of Mari, I think, that trying to figure out when we compared Orla to Tuma yesterday, what kind of Tuma? We're talking about Tumas Aguf or Tumas Basar. In the end, we were able to say that all in the entire Bryce was assuming Tumas Basar, that we're talking about the meat, the Korban Pesach being Tameh, not necessarily the people being Tameh, although there were different parts where we could argue that it's talking about the people being Tameh. And then we discussed shechting a non-Korban Pesach with the intention of a Korban Pesach, not an Erev Pesach. So we said that if you have, for example, a Korban Pesach that's more than a year old, so then you can't offer it as a Korban Pesach. So if on Erev Pesach you try to offer that as your Korban Pesach, it's going to be a problem, because it's no longer Shaykh to Korban Pesach. You have to offer it as a Shlamim. But the rest of the days of the year, even if you would offer it as a Korban Pesach, it would technically be okay, interestingly. Okay, but didn't we have a whole discussion yesterday, the other day, about like Korban Pesach, B'Shari Mos Hashana? I don't know. Cool. And then at the end we discussed like Sefer Yuchsin, how it got like lost, and then all the Chachamim got weak since then. Very interesting. Peace out.